Hey, Colts fans, this is Nathan Brown, Colts insider with the Indianapolis Star, here with Joel A. Erickson for another edition of the Colts Cover 2 podcast. We are now a week and a half or so into free agency. We're taping this on Thursday morning, the 19th, in case we get any major news coming out here in the next
Or
few
minor
hours.
news.
Or minor news. I mean, you never know. I mean, the last several afternoons, we've been getting brand new, like 2 or 3 players that just kind of come out of the blue signing wise, and talking to them, writing up stories on guys that were not on our radars. So odds are the by the time you're listening to this, the Colts probably will have signed some depth type players to their roster. We will get into all of that throughout this morning's episode, just kind of looking at the Colts' current depth chart and where they have really added some key depth, which is frankly what a lot of their signings outside of Daniel Jones and Alec Pierce have been so far in free agency, and also where they have some continuing holes. There are a couple positions that seem pretty obvious, but we will go through those both on the offense and defensive side of the ball, kind of go through some of the signings that we have seen over the last 10 days, see what we make of them, which ones stand out both positive and negatively, and kind of make a roadmap of what the rest of the Colts offseason, including the draft, will need to look like to fill out the gaps on this roster. So maybe start on the defensive side of the ball. That certainly feels like the place where the Colts have been the most active in free agency. We'll just go through a quick rundown before we get started here on players the Colts have signed in free agency. And this is not guys that they have re-signed, but new players on this roster. You have defensive end Arden Key and Michael Clemens, defensive tackle Derek Nottie, safeties Jonathan Owens and Wanya Thomas, tight end Carson Tote, who has not played a down of football in his career. We'll talk about him a little bit more later on in the episode. Cornerback Cam Taylor Britt, defensive tackle Jerry Tillery, linebacker Akeem Davis Gaither, and wide receiver Nick Westbrook Akine. Starting on the defensive side of the ball, Joel, you hear some of those names. Which new members of the Colts defense intrigues you the most, or feels like maybe the most consequential signing that they have made so far?
This is weird because it's the position where the most players are. It feels like the Colts have, like, we're going to get into some of the holes they have elsewhere in places where it feels real thin right now. But the place that doesn't feel thin is cornerback. And honestly, of all the 1-year signings, the one that interests me the most is Cam Taylor Britt.
Mm-hmm.
I know Sauce Gardner's there. I know Travarius Ward is there. I have been thinking about, like, why are you signing all these cornerbacks? You have so many of them. And then I don't know who it was, but somebody very astutely pointed out that they lost. Maybe it might have been our editor, that everyone they had got hurt last year multiple times, and they were frequently on cornerback 9. So having believe they're 9 deep as we record this, with guys who either played last year or what you would expect to play. But all that being said, Cam Taylor Britt has some pedigree. Like, this is a guy who, he was a second round pick, which doesn't always mean anything. There have been other second round picks who flamed out and did nothing. Ben Vanagoo, we're looking at you. But he was a starter for the Bengals for 2 years under Anarumo. He was their number 1 corner. He had 7 picks over 2 seasons. He really hasn't been great. And he wasn't, I'm not, great is the wrong word. He really hasn't been good outside of his second season in the league. But there's a little bit of pedigree there. There's a little bit of draft prospect pedigree there. There's some history of being a guy who can take away the football. There's been there's definitely some stuff. There's definitely some stuff there and some history there that makes me think maybe this guy can be a little more for them. And with Charvarius Ward potentially dealing with injury issues, injury issues at other spots. I think one thing is he's more of an outside corner than an inside corner, it sounds like. So I wouldn't be thinking about him in the slot necessarily. But there's some prospect pedigree there, and if maybe he's matured, if maybe he's because he had kind of acknowledged he had some personal stuff that messed with him last year and maybe the year before. You know, it sounds like that's something that everybody says, but then we talked to Arden Key last week, and who at one point was a third round bust for somebody, and has turned into a decent NFL veteran. And he said I had to mature, and so it does happen with some guys. Some guys do mature and become, much more valuable NFL players after kind of faltering. So the pedigree there, all that kind of interests me. How he gets on the field, I don't know, but like our editor pointed out, at this point last year, we were like, they have all these corners, and by the time training camp started, they were signing Xavier Howard.
Yeah, as you mentioned, of those 9, Cam Taylor-Britt is the only new member of that group. But of the other 8, all 8 of them started games for the Colts last year in the secondary. And some of the new pieces like Mooney Ward, as you mentioned, Sauce Gardner dealt with various injuries throughout the season, and that's what left the Colts needing to dig deep to go and sign guys like Cameron Mitchell, for example, who just was re-signed this morning. He is a guy who, now he didn't get his first start until the end of the season when the Colts certainly were bit by the injury bug a lot in that secondary position. And also I think probably wanted to just give Cameron Mitchell maybe a little bit of a deeper look there and giving him a start in the season finale. But I mean, that's someone that they signed to the practice squad in early October because they were so shallow at that position. Now, if you can keep all those guys healthy, certainly there are going to be some guys who do not make this roster, whether they are traded or waived or just cut in training camp. We'll have to see how that all shakes out. But that certainly feels like the position that you have the most confidence in outside of something like quarterback, where Daniel Jones is your odds-on starter. If they can stay healthy there, they have several starting caliber players that would start on lots of other teams around the league. You have to kind of, I think of Cam Taylor-Britt as a little bit of an injury insurance type guy, someone that could probably go and start on some other teams. He told us that part of the reason he was interested in joining the Colts is because of that relationship he has with Lou Anarumo, something that we also heard from Akeem Davis-Gaither, linebacker, another Cincinnati Bengals expat who was signed yesterday. So you've got a lot of strength at that position, guys who can fill in. Cam Taylor-Britt's not going to be maybe quite a Sauce Gardner or Mooney Ward level player if he gets on the field, but he certainly puts you in a lot better place than having to go out and say sign Cameron Mitchell off the just off the waiver wire, or putting Jonathan Edwards in the lineup, or some guys that they were having to play and rely on pretty heavily in the middle of last year when they were so bit by the injury bug. Those guys now are your 7th, 8th, 9th on the roster, and they were probably 3rd or 4th, sometimes maybe even 2nd, depending on the week. So that certainly feels like a solidified position group. Better than me on how many guys will go into a training camp at a certain position, but I can't imagine that they're going to be signing too many more guys at cornerback or at nickel, at least guys that you would expect to make much of a wave once we get to training camp in July and August.
Who knows? Maybe the entire defense will be defensive tackles and cornerbacks.
I mean, I know the common joke on Colts Twitter right now is, can any of those cornerbacks go and play linebacker? Can they beef up here in the next couple months and go and play linebacker?
Here's another piece of this that I think we can talk about right now. It's just this Lou Anarumo thing is at the point now where, like, it feels like too much to me. And I want to explore it a little bit more. I've got the owners' meetings coming up in a week and a half. I want to try to ask Chris Ballard about it. I want to try to ask Lou Anarumo about it. I don't think I'm going to get a great and real answer. I am curious. You know, when they have an opening, when they need a signing, his first instinct is to get somebody he's been with before. Um, and as a as a human, like that quality of being loyal to your guys uh, is generally something that I admire and appreciate. I don't know if it's great for a football team necessarily. It just trying to think off the top of my head who they went and got. Jermaine Pratt was actually not bad.
Mhm.
That's one of the better ones. Xavier Howard was a disaster.
So remind me, what's the Xavier Howard Bengals connection? That's something I probably
It's not a
should know, but
Bengals connection. It's a
okay,
Dolphins connection.
there we go. Okay,
Anarumo was the secondary coach who drafted Xavier Howard.
okay, there we
He
go.
has always believed in him. So Xavier Howard was a Lou Anarumo guy. That one blew up horribly. Mike Hilton as a replacement for Kenny Moore was going okay as a plug and play type guy. That one I can understand because of the complexities in the nickel position, wanting somebody who's been in your defense. If it's midstream, I kind of get that, especially when you lose Wally, you lose some of the guys that you thought would have been that moving into that spot. Um, they have already signed Akeem Davis Gaither, who was their nickel linebacker in Cincinnati. But if you look at his Cardinals numbers, didn't play the same way in that defense. So is he a nickel? They wanted to get younger and faster. Like, if he's your experienced player, is he the same player that he was before? I don't know. And then you have Cam Taylor Britt, who I just said I was intrigued by, but also is a guy that flamed out in Cincinnati. So it's a flyer. I think the reason I'm intrigued is because there's maybe more of a ceiling there than some of these other guys. And then obviously we know they wanted to get Trey Hendrickson. They wanted to sign Trey Hendrickson. They were in the lead for it until the Baltimore Ravens did the Baltimore Ravens stuff, and went back on Max Crosby and decided to sign Trey Hendrickson instead. And Hendrickson, obviously the biggest name out of all those players we mentioned, but that's six guys now that they've wanted to sign who are not just tied to Anarumo, but guys that he used to have. And I don't know. They've signed other guys who aren't Lou Anarumo types, but who aren't Lou Anarumo guys that he's been with before. But like, I just don't know if at this juncture of the offseason, if your defensive signing should follow that formula, or if you should be looking for upside guys that maybe he can learn to love in the future.
Yeah, I mean
He loves
there
his
are
pets.
there are four of those guys: Cam Taylor Britt, Mike Hilton, Akeem Davis Gaither, and Jermaine Pratt. Basically, all played on the same defense in those like early 2020s, that time frame with the Bengals. And granted, there were a few seasons there where that was an incredible defense, and that is in part why Lou Anarumo was snatched up by the Colts when he was a free agent a year ago and made their new defensive coordinator, and also in part why he got some attention as a potential head coach candidate throughout this past offseason, why he has had those opportunities previously and probably will continue to do so as he continues his NFL coaching career. But I would agree with you. I mean, there are 32 teams in this league. There certainly is some value maybe when you run a little bit more unique of a defense like Lou, that's matchup oriented. You want guys who are versatile, who can play lots of um, areas of the field in lots of different ways, depending on what the opposing offense is bringing you each week. But I don't know. I mean, when you've got guys who played elsewhere around the league, like there's so many more other players who are free agents other than guys who played in the Bengals a couple of years ago. And um, I guess if you are looking for guys purely in a depth role and hey, I know this guy, I know he can do what I want him to do, why would I go and sign someone else who I'm not familiar with, who I think can do what we're looking for in the role that we're trying to fill. I can understand why someone like that might, get a tiebreaker. But I mean, like when you look at someone like Akeem Davis Gaither, for example, I'm not pretending to be an expert on the um, depth linebackers who are still out there in free agency, but um, he doesn't, looking at some of his, his body of work, his stats, the lone season last year where he was a consistent starter with the Cardinals in his single season there, doesn't seem like I can't imagine the best linebacker that was still out there. I guess I'll just kind of put it bluntly that way. He signed a 2-year deal in Arizona, and he was released after a single season. Really struggled in pass coverage. Um, Not super duper great rushing the passer. He was okay in run game coverage. Has a lot of seems like a pretty powerful linebacker, but just lacks some other strengths outside of that. And so I don't know if you're trying to break a tie between two guys, one of which you're unfamiliar. I can understand why that would make a difference, but just purely going out and kind of just targeting guys who fit that mold does seem a little short-sighted, um, and feels like that could, um, I don't know, leave you a little bit more behind the eight ball than opening your horizons. And obviously, we know that the Colts are talking to way more than just the guys that they do go and eventually sign. But these are just the ones that have crossed the finish line, as we have seen over the last week and a half or so.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think linebacker. I know everyone has made note of the linebacker room. I continue to believe that, and no one said this to me, but I continue to believe that there's going to be the second round pick might just be a linebacker. The second round pick might be your number one linebacker next year. Now, there's some issues with that, namely that Lou Anarumo is not famous for loving young guys, but if you only give him young guys, maybe that's how they end up forcing him to play those dudes.
You can have depth here. Yeah, you can have depth on the defensive line and the secondary. But
you are playing younger, faster linebackers.
yeah, could be. Yeah, as someone who's gone through the mock draft process, I spent the last couple days churning through where I would eventually land on my second mock draft. There are, again, on paper, I'm not going to profess to be someone who's crunching film like crazy. There's some other folks who do a lot better job and are a lot more proficient at that side of the draft process than I am. But from everything you read, there do seem to be several. Um, I don't know if you want to say starting caliber, but maybe just promising linebacker prospects to get in the second round. Guys like Anthony Hill out of Texas, Jacob Rodriguez out of Texas Tech, Jake Golday from Cincinnati. He's actually who I drafted with my second round pick when I did my mock yesterday. That is published on IndyStar.com. I encourage you to go check that out. I actually also used a third round pick on Deontay Lawson out of Alabama. There are, I'd say, probably a half dozen guys that seem like they are likely to be around when the Colts get around to making their first selection in the second round. Chris Ballard, of course, is famous for trading back. So, if there are 2 or 3 of those guys still available, don't be surprised if he slides back 5 or 6 spots to try to, acquire another, third or fourth round pick to do so and just kind of take whichever guy is available. They absolutely do need to add some linebacker depth. Jermaine Pratt is still out there on the free agency market. I know he, had his moments in situations where he wasn't the strongest, but I think there's some arguments to be made that he was as good, if not maybe even better at times than Zaire Franklin last year. after joining the Colts in October when they picked him
Definitely
up.
better in pass coverage. Like he
Yeah,
definitely makes more plays against the pass.
absolutely. So if you, if you're needing to get younger and faster, I certainly don't know that you can expect to go and start two rookie linebackers on your crew there. So certainly someone like Akeem Davis Gaither gives you a veteran in there. Let's say they go and also do resign Jermaine Pratt if he ends up coming back to the Colts, and then maybe they sign one or two um, in the draft. You've also got Austin Ajike and Jalen Carlisle. All of a sudden, you're looking at 5 or 6 guys fighting for a couple spots there, and things feel a lot better. But certainly with where that position is right now, only with 3 guys on the roster, none of which really feel like guys you would want to try it out as starters on a competitive defense. That feels like to me the most troubling place on this roster at the moment.
Yeah, the just kind of the way this offseason has gone, you keep wondering like where's the other big move? And we know the one that they didn't hit, but like isn't one of the other things that sticks out is just like last year they made these big outside of just a quarterback. They went out and got Charvarius Ward, they went out and got Cam Bynum. There's an obvious position of need. This is the spot to go. Like where's the big move? That's I think what everybody's waiting for.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned right there. You can even just let's just take Daniel Jones out of the picture, because when you went and picked him up, he wasn't a definite starter. He obviously won the job in camp and became their starter. But when you sign Cam Bynum and you sign Charvarius Ward, those guys are going to be, as long as they stay healthy, of course, they're going to be starters in your defense the following season. When I look at the group of players that they have signed in free agency outside their team, I mean, I don't think there's a single guy here. Maybe Nick Westbrook-Akine for that number 3 wide receiver spot, and of course, you're not always going to have 3 wide receivers on the field, so that's almost kind of a secondary starter in that sense. There's not a single guy on here who is just a bona fide guaranteed starter. And that's kind of where, when we come away from those series of press conferences with Carly Gordon and then Chris Ballard the week after the season ended, and we hear time and time again about how the sense of urgency is as high as it's ever been. I know that they tried to make a big swing with signing Trey Hendrickson, as you mentioned, and that didn't fall through. But it feels to me like they, that one kind of slipped through their fingers, and then they just haven't really had a secondary plan of attack. I mean, you have to know when you're going through negotiations that your number one target might not work out, and it feels like, they were, they knew that the deals with Daniel Jones and Alec Pierce were coming together in the background as well, and so those were not going to be cheap. Although, as you've broken down with a couple stories over the last couple of days, the contracts with the cap hits are actually pretty favorable to the Colts in this one season, and so there was room. There was a spot on the roster to kind of carve out that type of money to go sign a Trey Hendrickson. But when that doesn't happen, and then you're not able to kind of respond or bounce back and go sign the best linebacker on the market, or go and sign whatever next best edge rusher is still available, like a Bradley Chubb, or just even decide, hey, Trey, by waiting on you, we have now, missed out on guys 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 that we would have been happy to sign. And, they kind of went all in, missed out on a couple other options there. And then, and I don't know, we're kind of in a between a rock and a hard place at that point. But even then, I mean, it's been a more than a week since the Hendrickson signings to the Ravens. I certainly would have expected at the time that we would have gotten another splash-ish type move, and you're right, we haven't seen that. We knew at that point they needed a starting caliber linebacker. They needed a defensive end. Um, you're not going to expect Arden Key or JTT to go and start in that position next year. I certainly don't think, but still now getting close to 2 weeks into free agency, those holes are still very, very much there.
Yeah, Arden Key is a guy who, like, if he has to start 2 or 3 games, you don't hate it. Like, he's a rotational pass rusher. He's not a he's not going to change the pass rush. He's not going to completely alter the pass rush. Maybe Hendrickson was the only guy out there that they thought was a receiver, and that's why they waited so long. But this is kind of what we talked about last podcast. That's where you need to improve, and you need to improve there. They haven't even tried to dissuade us from that in the offseason when we talked about it. That your edge rush must be better, and they've even acknowledged that they can't count on Latu. So, are they looking for Jonathan Grenard? Are they trying to use the Ravens shenanigans to backdoor something for Max Crosby? That seems very unlikely with the first round picks they don't have. But I'm just trying to figure out it's the clear obvious need. And yes, you need a linebacker, and maybe probably two.
Mm-hmm.
I think you need a linebacker in the second round, and you need a linebacker in the fourth or fifth to compete with Jalen Carlisle or be there.
And you probably still need another veteran on top of that, right?
Probably. If you have Davis Gaither and Carlisle and two rookies, he's got to play special teams. But yeah, probably because you have a GK2 who you liked enough to play as a. He's the only other linebacker who really played snaps last year.
Yeah.
But that position is easier to fill. The guy who's going to transform the pass rush. Who is it? Especially if you're moving down in the draft and not moving up.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the best way I've been able to visualize this and kind of talk about it, I think, is you the guys that you have on the roster right now are, you would say, guys who are playing alongside Latu. And yes, the Colts expect Latu to take another jump in the offseason going into his third season next year. But I mean, realistically, what can we expect from that jump? Is that getting to 10 sacks, 11 sacks? He's just, from what we've seen in his first 2 years, he's a guy who is great at being a secondary guy who can mop up plays, who can make a second move and go and try to get the quarterback. He's not often enough the guy who is initiating the pressure, who is the focal point of making a quarterback scramble and pushing him into someone else on your defensive line or your front seven to finish up a sack. And so when you envision an idea of, and again, I certainly wouldn't expect the Colts to do this, but we haven't seen a move to prove otherwise. If you have Arden Key or JTT or Michael Clemens starting, those are guys who are starting and being the secondary edge rusher to Latu. And I just don't know that you can go into next season with an effective pass rush and that be the case. You have to have a guy who is the primary edge rusher and then have Latu continue to develop in year 3. And hopefully that's all it takes to be able to get to that primary edge rusher level. Yes, you have an incredible secondary if it stays healthy, who can play well in man coverage, and maybe that gives you a little bit more time in the front seven to get to the quarterback in pass rush situations. So maybe that doesn't have to be the premier division of your defense, but you still need more juice than what they have there right now. I'm curious, you mentioned Jonathan Grenard. It almost feels at this point almost a little bit lazy to mention it as a possibility, but it just seems like the the one option that still exists out there for Colts fans to hope for Indianapolis getting some sort of a number one caliber edge rusher. What, when you think of the prospect of the Colts trading for him in the coming weeks, maybe leading up to the draft, for example, what would you imagine a deal like that would take to get done from a compensation standpoint?
Well, I don't think it's as much as whatever's been said, because if it was, the deal would already be done somewhere. So I do think that maybe that's not as costly as it seems from a trade compensation type standpoint. Do they like the fit? We don't know that. He's kind of in the Arden King mold in that he gets off the ball a lot faster than anybody else the Colts had last year. But I think of Lou, like Trey Hendrickson is a bigger defensive end. Does he want the bigger defensive ends? Would you want to have? Is Grenard that type of player for them, or do they think they need to have something else? Yeah, but I do think anybody who's still available, like the compensation, anybody who we knew was available and is still available, it makes me think that that the Vikings are asking for something and the league is essentially saying, we don't want to pay that and we're going to try to wait you out.
Yeah, I know the common refrain seemed to be like somewhere around a third round pick or so. I mean, if you're Colts, the way I have thought about it, and again, this is not necessarily a way to think about it if you're trying to plan long term as a GM, because a third round pick is a guy who will be pretty cheap for you for 4 years, and yes, he might not be a starting caliber guy in year one, but you hope maybe he gets close to that in year two or year three. But if I'm thinking, if I'm the Colts and I can go and use my third round pick to get someone who can be my top edge rusher for 2026, and I know that there is as much as it feels like it's on the line going into this season, I don't know that feels all that costly. When I know how much of a need I have and what the other options seemingly are out there to fill this hole that I have on my roster in an effective manner. Again, we don't know what's being discussed behind the scenes, but that certainly feels like it's been kind of the common fallback. Hey, why would you not trade a third round pick for Jonathan Grenard? Again, he is coming off injury. He only had a couple sacks last year, coming off of back-to-back seasons where he had at least 12, one season in Houston and one season in Minnesota. I believe he's looking for an extension. He still has 2 seasons left on his current deal. So what numbers is he asking for in terms of an extension to help appease him in that process? That's something you have to consider too. His base salary right now is right around $18.3 million. So when you look at the cap space that the Colts have left, as these 1-year deals continue to roll in, it seems like it's somewhere. The picture's still a little hazy on that, but it seems like it's somewhere in the like $25-ish million range right now.
I think maybe a little more. All these $1 million deals replace like rookie deals, and so it's not. It's kind of like $500,000 off the cap instead of a full million.
Sure.
I don't know what over the cap says. They confused people early on, and it made me mad, and so I haven't been looking.
Yeah, I've kind of been trying to refrain from it too, but yeah, maybe somewhere in like the $25 to $30 million range. If you go and sign someone that big, and you consider an extension, I mean, I think I want to say he's 29 years old. I don't have it right in front of me. I was looking at it yesterday. So if you're doing an extension, you're agreeing to 4 more years, maybe 3, but maybe 4 more years with a guy who's just coming off an injury, who, has had some great seasons recently, but you are a little unsure if he can replicate that. So that's a little bit of a risk. I can understand some of the trepidation there between giving a third round pick, spending that much money, and linking yourself for several more years to a guy like that who, um, certainly didn't have a great season a season ago. So that complicates things a little bit, but it also certainly feels like you're the best option that you have out there on the table at the moment. So we'll see where that goes in the coming weeks. But I would definitely think that edge rusher along with linebacker is something that you look at and consider somewhere in the first 4 rounds or so, and use a lot of that draft capital that you do have to try to fill some of these gaps on the defense. Before we transition to the offense, obviously there's still
I have one thing.
Yes.
Real quick.
Yeah.
I have a history on this pod. You don't know this because it's the first draft cycle for you, but I have a history on this pod of falling in love with one draft prospect every year. And this is completely based on vibes. This is not like this is just who I watched playing college football last year. In this case, I actually think this might be one of the worst ones I've had because it's a position the Colts need. And if you look at other players around him, I think they fit Ballard's mold better. And so maybe this isn't likely. But my one guy this year is Jacob Rodriguez.
Yeah.
I loved watching that dude. I love dudes who take away the football. I love dudes who play with their hair on fire. I loved it. Now, again, I looked like Anthony Hill, much longer arms. Ballard loves long arms and linebackers. Jake Golday, same thing. Lot lengthier players. I'm sorry. That's what I watched. I watched Texas Tech and I watched Jacob Rodriguez, and that's my guy for this draft. My guy. I will say this: if you're listening to this and you're thinking, well, it's dumb that you like Jacob Rodriguez. He's got short arms and he doesn't really fit what Ballard drafts in linebackers. I don't think they've ever picked one of the guys that I really liked. I think I've thrown this out every time and they've never picked one of them. But just in spirit of the pod, I wanted to get it out there early. In spirit of the tradition of the pod, I wanted to get it out there early. The guy I loved in this draft was Jacob Rodriguez.
I mean, you look at his stats and you think of what Chris Ballard has said about wanting to get younger and faster, and you look at his pedigree. I mean, again, the profile from his frame notwithstanding, I mean, some of the stuff he's done over the last couple of seasons there at Texas Tech, like it's hard to imagine a better, younger, faster guy who could be available in the second round. When you look at, I mean, he forced 7 fumbles last year. He took 4 interceptions. He's got a sack, defended 6 passes. Just like and I didn't watch him as much as you did, but a guy that I think you can kind of envision being everywhere on the field, a ball hawk, and that's why I feel like, I mean, he was one of those guys as I was kind of going through the mock draft process, doing different versions. It was between him, Jake Golday, and Anthony Hill. It feels like if you get through the second round and you end up with one of those guys, I feel like you've done about as much as you could hope. They all bring different strengths, and different pluses, different minuses, but those guys I think have to be your targets there with where you're picking there in the middle of the second round.
Here's the thing. So our editor Nat Newell is a big analytics guy, big numbers guy, and he always says, turnover production can't be replicated year over year. He's generally right, but also they have had a linebacker here before who was the exception of that rule. His name was Shaquille Leonard, and so maybe Jacob Rodriguez is another exception to the rule. Maybe he's a guy the ball just finds, or more accurately, he finds the ball. Again, they're going to draft one of the other linebackers, and they're probably going to be really good. And because Ballard's good at picking linebackers, and Jacob Rodriguez will play somewhere else. But just to be faithful to the spirit of the Cover 2 pod, there's my guy for the draft.
Good to know. Before we move on to the offense, the defensive line, real quick. I know we've spent a lot of time, of course, on defensive end, but other guys that they have signed. I guess you've got Arden Key and Michael Clemens both at defensive end, and then Derek Nottie at defensive tackle, along with Colby Wooden, who they landed in a trade with the Packers. Arden Key, as we've mentioned, a guy who has a big burst off the line, not nearly as big, maybe doesn't profile quite like a bigger, more powerful defensive end like a Trey Hendrickson that you would have been looking for. Certainly feels like you would hope a guy who can bring a burst of energy as a rotational guy, kind of in that Samson Mebukam role a little bit, and a guy who's a little bit younger and has a little bit more speed coming off the line than Samson did. What do you make of some of these other moves here? Certainly feels like, if you can get a starter level guy, that these positions are fairly fleshed out and not needing a ton more depth to be signed. But again, that starter guy at defensive end is the biggest chess piece of them all.
Yeah. It's a lot of flyers. They're taking a lot of flyers on guys. I like Colby Wooden. We talked about that last pod. I like the idea of Colby Wooden at least. Key is sort of like, well, I just kind of think of Key as just like that's a you know what you're going to get from him as a pass rusher. Mm-hmm. But I don't want him to start.
Yeah.
I don't want him to start right now. He's starting. I don't want that. Yeah. I think defensively, it's Derek Nottie he's going to be in a fight for a roster spot. Especially they signed Jerry Tillery now. Tim Smith is coming back. I wouldn't expect him to be really battling with Colby Wooden for a roster spot, given what Wooden did with the Packers last year. So that's one of the interesting things, is that we were talking about the lack of a big name guy. It's interesting that Chris Ballard has decided to make all of these small veteran salary benefit type deal signings. They're taking a lot of flyers and stuff. And now I can't remember if I said this at the beginning of the pod or if I said it pre-pod, but like sometimes those work out. Like Neville Gallimore wasn't paid very much and he was really good. But Corey Ballantyne was also signed right after Neville Gallimore, and he got cut like August 3rd or something. So there's this sort of micro investment he's done is a little bit of a difference from. I don't think he's ever signed this many dudes like that this early in free agency, and there's some boomer bust there. There's some real boomer bust with that strategy.
It also continues the ability that if this all goes south this season, and we are looking at a regime change at general manager and potentially head coach as well, this roster is also very much largely cleared out after this year, outside of Alec Pierce and Daniel Jones, who again, if things don't go well with Daniel Jones at quarterback, as you've written about and detailed in a couple stories, the cost for the Colts losing him in terms of a cap hit next season wouldn't be all that large. And if you are tearing this all down to the studs, a few $1 million spent on a quarterback who's no longer on the roster really isn't that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things.
All you need to do, like, just in terms of understanding, like, the way a rebuilding team looks at money, just look at the Dolphins.
Yes. Yeah.
The Dolphins are carrying like more than half of their cap in dead money, and they don't care because they're redoing the whole thing. So if that's what happens in Indy, like if they have to take, what would it be? If they have to take $60 million or whatever of cap hit on next year's to cut Daniel Jones, they'll do it, and they won't care because they know they're going to be bad anyway.
Yeah. I think, I think I've seen something where right now the Dolphins roster, maybe this excludes Malik Willis, but outside of Willis, I don't think anyone else on the Dolphins roster has a cap hit of more than like $11 million this year, which is just absolutely wild. I also think they are like well over $100 million in dead money for this upcoming season, including what, like 55 of it to Tua, and they've got Tyreek Hill and Bradley Chubb and some other players across that team. It's the rebuild they're doing there is really pretty amazing. But yeah, I mean, outside of Jones and Pierce and um, Sauce Gardner and I think Cam Bynum. I'm sure there's some, and some other guys on rookie deals that extend beyond that. Like there really aren't many big name players with contracts that go beyond the 2026 season. Jonathan Taylor, Grover Stewart, DeForest Buckner. Um, uh, though there's an ability if this Colts 2026 season does not go well and they feel like they need to start over at the very, very top. There's an ability where you can kind of create a new roster, and that's what a lot of these 1-year deals that they've gotten on kind of some of these boomer bust type depth signings over the last week or so give you just additional flexibility to be able to do. One thought before we go to the offense, you mentioned Max Crosby and potentially being some sort of a dark horse team to sign him. I would imagine that this rule, if it is passed, would not something that would go live in the near future. I don't know a ton of background behind it. Need to read up a little bit more, but the idea that there could be an opportunity for teams now to trade away as many as 5 first-round picks in the future could potentially give the Colts flexibility to go and sign or send 2 more the way of the Las Vegas Raiders, and then Colts fans could just like have an even bigger fit about the Colts having virtually no first-round picks for the foreseeable future than they already feel like they do right now.
Real quick, what's your thoughts on that proposal? I kind of hate it. I'm curious what you think.
I mean, it certainly lends itself to the ability to have more bigger trades, kind of like we see in the NBA, where you have a lot more big name player movements. Not just in almost feels like you have as many, if not more, in the NBA via trade than you do through true free agency in terms of the caliber of a player who would go for 1 or 2 first round picks. I mean, it does feel like at the same time in the NBA, things can kind of get a little bit out of hand and can kind of go off the rails if guys are more easily traded. Then free agency isn't nearly the thing it could be or has been. You don't have as many big name guys hitting the market because maybe they're asking for a trade if things start to go south, which I think is maybe the level of that we have in the NBA takes away from things at times. I don't know. I mean, certainly you don't have as many teams trading first round picks for guys, so I don't know how much it's needed.
First round picks are also more valuable in the NFL than they are in the NBA.
Oh, absolutely, without question.
Like the Pacers were basically like, if it's not the top 4, we don't care.
Yep.
This year. And like that's not a thing in the NFL. In the NFL, the 15th pick or the 16th pick can be very valuable. Here's my thing. As somebody who watches the NBA, like the NBA offseason gets really confusing. It's really hard to keep track of, what the value is of a pick. What the value isn't of a pick, like all of that stuff is very difficult. And like my way through it is to kind of just like pay attention to, Indy Star Pacers beat writer Dustin Dopirak, and he'll tell me what the Pacers are going to do. And then, if I follow another team, I'll follow their beat writer. But I cannot keep track of values and stuff and who's available and who's not available and all that stuff the same way you can, I feel like, in the NFL. That's my biggest thing. It's because like someone will be like, "Oh, this team's a dark horse for this," and then they'll be like, "That's because they have 15 picks in 2033," and you're like, "What?" I don't know how to process all that. So that's kind of my thing. I don't love trading future picks way down the road. I like it as a fan. I think it's difficult.
Yeah, and I think in some way allows teams and GMs to be like you can get in a lot deeper hole if you make some moves that involve multiple first round picks and those moves don't go well and you know all of a sudden you're stuck as a team. Let's say for example the Colt this passes and it is instituted and the Colts immediately go and trade two more first round picks for Max Crosby. If this Colts team goes 7-10 and they tear it down to the studs and all of a sudden you're past this season and you still don't have first round picks for 3 more years. Again, I mean, for a team that is like desperately needing to rebuild and you lose your most valuable asset in the draft until what would that be 2030, at a time where Max Crosby may have kind of passed his prime. Sauce Gardner is now, nearing 30 years old. It's just a hard thing to imagine in the NFL where you've got 7 rounds and as you mentioned, those first round picks are so much more valuable. And they go for so much more than say a second round pick. It's tough to imagine. I mean, I'm sure there would be ways where that could go well. It could be really beneficial for a team that is just in this like constant win now mode, like a team like the Los Angeles Rams that doesn't.
Our boy Les Snead, he would trade all of his first round. Like they would never have a first round pick.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a team that I can think of that would absolutely be championing for something like this. But in terms of for the good of the league as a whole, I probably tend to agree with you that it's. I don't know that it feels like it's fixing a problem that maybe doesn't necessarily exist at the moment.
That's a good way to put it. I was just curious what your first reaction was because like mine was like, oh no.
I mean, the thing with the NBA too is like
I didn't think about this. If they do that, I'm going to have to be the one explaining what all their assets are for everybody. I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I mean, and the weird thing in the NBA too is that like you can't trade picks in successive years. So then you've got the swap stuff, and you can get into these like weird 3 or 4 way swap situations where it's just like it's impossible to understand where picks are going or where they're coming from. You have these like never ending player trade trees that go on for like seasons upon seasons at a time where a trade like hasn't totally been closed out because you've got these picks that are going to 3 or 4 different teams or swaps that are traveling around. It can be really hard to follow. I agree. And at the moment, the way picks can be traded in the NFL, just feels like fairly clean. That and free agency still feels fairly clean at the moment. And selfishly, it'd be nice to keep it that way, I think.
There's a Pacers fan listening to this who has it all like locked down in their head, like exactly what assets they have. And they're like, guys, this is easy. This is like the easiest thing in the world. I don't know why you think it's difficult to keep track of.
Wasn't it the Paul George trade tree that like I think that's a running joke in Pacers Twitter about just like what that trade turned into, between Victor Oladipo and Sabonis, and then eventually, Sabonis turning into Halliburton, and all of the different ways that has evolved over the decade or so since he left the team.
That sounds like a really fun way to spend the first half of Ohio State TCU is trying to figure out if the Pacers won that trade.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, let's before we wrap up here, again, not as many changes on the offensive side of the ball for the Colts. Guys that they have lost in free agency on offense. Actually, pretty short list. It is 2 offensive linemen, veteran offensive tackle Braden Smith and rotational center Danny Pinter. The Colts have of course,
Michael Pittman.
And yeah, I was going to say the Colts have traded away Michael Pittman Jr. and they have, of course, as we mentioned earlier, re-signed Alec Pierce, Daniel Jones, Drew Ogletree, and Mo Alley Cox at tight end. They've re-signed Laquan Treadwell, who wide receiver, who a lot more active on special teams, and then they have signed in free agency wide receiver Nick Westbrook Akine and Carson Tote, who you may recognize as a name in college basketball circles, who just about 2 weeks ago played his last college basketball game for Notre Dame. Someone who we talked to a couple of days ago said that he was pushing to try and be a dual sport athlete in college over this last season, found out he did not have any more college football eligibility, which then meant that he could be signed immediately as an undrafted free agent, because he technically would have been eligible for the NFL draft last spring, of course, did not enter, and was signed by the Colts a couple days ago as a project at that tight end spot.
Real quick on Carson Tote. I know there's people who are like, why would they sign a basketball player? Because sometimes those basketball players end up playing in the NFL for 10 years. Like, there's 90 guys on the roster. And when the season starts, there'll be 53, and there'll be a practice squad full of dudes. And honestly, not all of those dudes can be contributors on Sundays. They just can't. Like, numerically speaking, there's 46 dudes active. And so there is value in getting guys that could be something down the line. I know there's a lot of people who don't think Mo Alley Cox has been valuable for the Colts because they play fantasy football and they think all tight ends do is receive the ball. That was very, very. I apologize. That was too dismissive. But also, tight ends block. Every team has a blocking tight end, every single one. And there is value in having a player who does that really well. That's why Mo Alley Cox is still here. It has nothing to do with his receiving. His receiving ended up being very disappointing, I think. But the man can block. Anyway, there is value in having those guys, those developmental guys. They turn into things eventually, sometimes. Mo Alley Cox, if people are like, how many guys have done this? It's more than you think. And it's not just – that's even if you take out Antonio Gates and Tony Gonzalez, which I think by now most people in the NFL have realized, like, every time that someone signs a basketball player, we can't be thinking it's those guys, right? Mm-hmm. But, like, Marcus Pollard, Eric Swope. There's a guy named Chris Manhertz who I think just re-signed in New York. He was a basketball player from Canisius, maybe? That the Saints signed when I was covering them. He's been in the league for 12 years. Like, he's had value to NFL teams for 12 years. One of the reasons that they sign these guys is because currently in college ranks, tight ends do not have to do the stuff they have to do blocking in the NFL. Tight ends in college are often just bigger wide receivers. And so it's hard to find guys who can block. Well, the thing about basketball players is they have no bad habits. They have no bad history. They have no anything. You can, like, Carson Tote even said it. Tom Manning told him when Mo came, he didn't know anything. We had to teach him everything. Well, when you teach somebody everything from the ground up, you have a chance to get a player who's really good at that thing that those other guys don't do, because in his head, that's just what football is, versus somebody who's been doing it for a long time and has to correct stuff. There's no correcting. You're just building it. So this is my mini rant. Like, it's odd. It's very odd. The most interesting thing to me is that they signed him literally 10 days after his basketball season ended. Like, you and I are taping this literally as the tournament tips off. It tips off in like 4 minutes. And the Colts already signed the guy who played college basketball this season. So that's the interesting part of it to me. There's some eligibility stuff that went into that. But in terms of taking a flyer on it, it's a really weird thing to get upset about. Like, this is not like a free agent signing the way Arden Key is a free agent signing. This is essentially a lottery ticket. And it's to see if you can do something that you've done before. That's all it is.
I mean, he is incredibly athletic. As you mentioned, an athletic guy who doesn't have any of those preconceived notions of what being a tight end needs to be. I mean, you think of about guys who even played well, let's say in high school, and then they go to the college ranks and they kind of have to relearn some things, or they're under a coaching staff who likes things done a certain way, or who thinks certain parts of the game technique wise should be done one way. And now you've got guys who are transferring every year, every couple years, and so they're learning and relearning or modifying their techniques in different ways. And then you get to the NFL, and they've kind of got this like hybrid way of doing things. And if that's not how an NFL coaching staff thinks something should be done, then as you mentioned, they've got to spend time reteaching and refining those techniques. That's not to say that that process is more difficult than teaching someone things from the ground up, but maybe it's in some ways a little less complicated. He led Division I college basketball. Like, we're talking every single college basketball team that you probably ever heard of. He was the
leading 300 something teams,
leading rebounder in after the 2024-2025 season in terms of rebounds per game. He transferred to Notre Dame, not nearly as much from a stats standpoint this past season in his lone season in South Bend as his campaign at Northern Arizona University, where he spent the bulk of his college career. But he's a big, athletic, fairly lean guy for how tall he is. You have to have good hands to have the assists and blocks and steals and rebounds that he was able to produce as a big man in college basketball. And so I think a lottery ticket, like you mentioned, I mean, that's a great way to put it. Not every player that you sign going into training camp, and again, teams have 90 players that they bring into training camp. Not all 90 of those guys need to be players that even have some modicum of hope to make the 53-man roster when things are all said and done. And sometimes a guy like that might really surprise you, and maybe you want to use your third or fourth tight end spot on someone like a Carson Tote. I mean, you think of guys behind Tyler Warren, Will Mallory, Drew Ogletree, and Mo Alley Cox, two of those that they, of course, re-signed this past offseason. Hey, maybe there's a chance he could get onto the roster as the team's fourth tight end. But when I think about him, I think of him as someone who would probably really benefit from being on a practice squad and getting reps every single day, working throughout the course of an NFL season and kind of using it as an elongated training camp where he can learn what football is like and what being a tight end is like. And maybe he turns into a guy that could replace, a Mo Alley Cox at some point, who can catch the occasional pass, but also can be a standout blocker, which is, again, someone that you absolutely have to have on your roster, especially when you have as high-powered a run game as you do with having Jonathan Taylor in the backfield.
Now, the other piece of the offense, Nick Westbrook-Akine, we kind of build him as a potential Pittman replacement. That might be ambitious. He only caught 11 passes last year. I think the interesting thing with him is that prior to Miami, he had a history of getting deep in Tennessee, and I think that's something that with these sort of minimum, with these sort of like minimum contract types, I'm looking for, like, why would the Colts be interested? Why would the Colts think like this guy could help? I think with him specifically, like a bigger bodied guy who can get down the field is the kind of player that Shane Steichen, I feel like, could use. But in terms of like replacing Pittman as a starter, that at the best, at most, I think he'll compete.
Yeah, I mean, you look at his history in the league. Let's maybe even take that year, this past season in Miami out. I mean, he's in no season has he had more than 60 targets. Michael Pittman Jr., even this past season was used to getting, upwards of 100 targets and catching about 80 balls. So at least in terms of his body of work over the course of his career, that was mostly spent in Tennessee with the Titans. Um, Nick Westbrook-Akine hasn't been used to nearly that much production now. I think you can reasonably expect to take some of those targets that Michael Pittman Jr. was getting and sprinkle them around between Josh Downs and Alec Pierce and Tyler Warren, and maybe envision a world in where all three of those guys are playing a little bit bigger roles, and maybe then someone like Westbrook Akine could slide into a role where you're catching, you're seeing 50 balls a year, which works out to somewhere around 3 targets a game. Maybe you're catching a pass or two. Um, but I also think you need to bring in another, whether it's in the draft or picking someone else up in free agency. I know Jawan Jennings was someone that you mentioned on our last podcast as someone who could potentially fill that role. That feels to me like someone who would be maybe in a little bit more of a starting caliber role. But I have to think that the Colts are planning on getting Alec Pierce the ball more than just the 84 targets that he saw this past year. And so there's only going to be so many targets to sprinkle around. So part of me wonders if someone like Jawan Jennings, who continues to be a free agent, that I think some folks might have expected to have been signed by someone by now, who knows if he is content with going and being, having to fight with Josh Downs and Tyler Warren for that second or third most targets on the team, whereas someone like Nick Westbrook-Akine might, be more comfortable in that because he's frankly just been that guy over the course of his career. He is someone who has never caught more than 38 balls in a season, who has never had more than 500 yards, but is someone who can be found whether you're looking for a deep threat guy who can maybe pop the top off a defense in a way where Alec Pierce is going to be used, I think, a little more just kind of all around the field in his new number one role this year. Westbrook-Akine's, maybe a guy that you bring in the red zone or when you're trying to make a splash deep threat type play and catch a defense off guard. I mean, he caught 9 touchdown passes in 2024 with only 32 catches. There's something to be said about that. And again, kind of like the theme of this entire pod, maybe not someone who was really on our radar when we're thinking about moves the Colts could make, but I think there could also be some value that he could bring. I think you just have to hope that the Colts bring in some additional depth at wide receiver, either through free agency or the draft, to have a little bit more of a competition to see who ultimately is best fit for that starting number 3 wide receiver role going into this season.
We're at the point now where, and this is the point that Colts fans hate, and I get it. Like, I get that you want the big splash signing, but like, I've been checking my phone and watching signings happen across the league while we've been doing this pod, and all of them fall into like, oh, hey, that guy. What's he doing now? Or alternately, wait, I need to Google that guy. I don't know who that guy's name is.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's 1 year deals. It's the kind of signings that you get. Like, you're not getting the impact guys. And like we kind of talked about at the beginning of the podcast, like it's these are guys that don't cost a lot, so it doesn't hurt you if you have to cut them, but they don't necessarily raise the level of your team. Nick Westbrook-Akine definitely like upgrades your depth. You have a better chance of, if someone gets hurt in training camp, something like that, you have a player who's a veteran, who's experienced. But does he replace Michael Pittman? That's a stretch. Even in a reduced role, that's a stretch. That leaves one spot, really, and that's the offensive line. And you and I both think, we were talking about this before we started this pod, like, there's some concern there. They've lost 2 guys out of their like 8-man, their group of 8 that they would want to have on Sunday last year, and they have not replaced them at all.
Yeah, Braden Smith, of course, a starter, who I imagine the Colts feel like Jalen Travis can slide into that starting role and replace, and that's all well, good and fine. But you still, as we saw last year, even when you go into camp feeling like you pretty well solidified already who your starting 5 offensive linemen are going to be, you still need some reliable depth because you are going to have injuries at some point. When if you rattle off their starters between Bernard Ryman, Quentin Nelson, Tanner Bortolini, Matt Goncalves, Jalen Travis, like that's a good group. But you look at the players right now who line up behind them. There's not a whole lot of experience there. You've got, in terms of just guys who are currently on the roster today, Blake Freeland, Josh Sills, Jimmy Morrissey, Dalton Tucker, Baron Matos, Ladarius Henderson, Bill Murray, and Jack Wilson, if the list in front of me is correct. That's
Bill Murray, offensive lineman. It's important to say
that. Yes. That puts you on some pretty shaky ground. And frankly, it makes it feel, and the Colts have had a lot of success in the Chris Ballard era. It also feels like a place where they could look to target some guys in the draft in that 4th, 5th round area. Say they trade back a time or two and they pick up an extra couple picks. I feel like linebacker, maybe edge rusher, and you could say wide receiver and offensive line, those feel like the positions to me where they really needed to draft someone in those first 4 or 5 rounds, where you would typically find someone that even at the back end might have an ability, if you find the right guy and you can develop him well, which the Colts have had a lot of success at with Tony Sperano Jr. as their offensive line coach. You need to, I think, find a couple more guys, probably a guard and a tackle who you feel confident in as a backup, because we've seen it on some teams this year, the Chargers, for example. They almost had an entire backup offensive line, having to defend, and keep Justin Herbert upright when they were trying to make a push toward the playoffs. That's not a position you want to be in. That's not a place that you would predict you're going to be in when the season starts, but you have to have enough depth there that you can feel comfortable as a team that has playoff aspirations. If you get an injury or two, that you don't lose too many steps. And that's certainly a place where I feel like the Colts have got to make some moves.
Yeah, and guys are going to get hurt. Blake Freeland got hurt last year. There was another year where Danny Pinner got hurt in training camp or preseason game, and they don't play, and then you lose that depth piece. So you got to have some guys there. Yep. It's a long pod, but it feel like every time we start talking about something, we come back to, well, they could probably add more. They need to add a little bit bigger name.
Yeah, it's been an off season, and again, I don't want to discount the moves that have been made, because I do think when you look at, Arden Key, solid depth on the edge. I think they have some intriguing guys at safety who we didn't really even talk a whole lot about, and Jonathan Owens and Wanya Thomas, guys who have been starters at times at points in their NFL careers, have also been impact guys on special teams. Those are guys who I think could potentially, in the right situation, depending on what they look like in training camp, those could be guys that could challenge for a starting or heavy rep rotational type spot. Cam Taylor-Britt, again, I think a solid pickup for a depth cornerback. Nick Westbrook-Akine, potentially a guy who could factor into the wide receiver rotation. There's some good solid moves here, but we are really lacking one or two of those big splash type moves that we got used to in what I know a lot of folks have kind of deemed like the new turned over a new leaf Chris Ballard that we saw in free agency last year, where the Colts made some bigger splashes. Just to run through, I think this list has been really helpful for me. NFL.com has a running list on who they feel like are still the best players available in free agency. I'll just kind of run through. Again, I know rankings might be different depending on which outlet you go to, but in terms of, let's just say like the top 10 guys that they deem to be the best available still in free agency: Jawan Jennings, wide receiver; Calais Campbell, a 40-year-old defensive lineman. That is the second best player available in free agency right now, according to NFL.com.
He's older than me.
Joey Bosa, edge rusher. Kirk Cousins, 38-year-old quarterback, fourth best player available in free agency right now. DJ Reader, defensive tackle, 32 years old. Stephon Diggs, 32-year-old wide receiver. Aaron Rodgers, a 42-year-old quarterback. Debo Samuel, 30-year-old wide receiver. Kevin Zeitler, hope I pronounced that correctly, getting up there in age, 36-year-old offensive guard. Hassan Reddick, another edge rusher, and Jawan Taylor, offensive tackle. Those are the type of guys. And I guess we'll end it here as the guy who Joel knows very well, Cam Jordan, 37-year-old edge rusher, who spent his career with the Saints and is looking to maybe try to find another spot for him before he calls it quits. There's not a whole lot. Frankly, I don't know that there are any guys who you would say are left to be had in a true splash signing. There may be some big names that could, raise some headlines, guys that in a proper situation could impact a starting roster for you. Juwan Jennings, maybe, for example, at wide receiver, could work, but there is no one left who is just like a bona fide, I know that guy is going to be starting for my team and making a major impact in 2026 guy. There's some spot position edge rushers, but no one that's going to define a defensive line. Those guys are just, they've come and gone. We are now 10 days or more into free agency, and this is what's left. And so this is what the Colts are working with as they continue to evaluate the landscape and figure out if there are going to be more signings, but what signings they continue to make as we get closer and closer now to the draft, and figure out kind of what final holes they feel like they need to fill before we get there to that 3-day stretch in the end of April. Anything left you want to mention before we finish things up here?
I'm intrigued by Wanya Thomas too. We didn't get to the safeties, but he's intriguing to me.
Yeah, he's a guy, again, someone whose season ended prematurely last year due to injury. Felt like he was kind of starting to hit his stride in Dallas with the Cowboys, a team that doesn't really have a well-defined number one guy there at that strong safety position to fill in for Nick Cross, who went to the Commanders in free agency. He certainly feels like a guy who may be best equipped to take that role right now. We'll have to see how that battle shakes out in training camp, but certainly a guy to keep an eye on, along with Jonathan Owens, who they signed concurrently, who has been on several teams over the last couple of years between Houston, Green Bay, and the Chicago Bears. That wraps things up here for us on the Colts Cover 2 podcast. Thanks to those of you who listen. Please like and subscribe on whichever podcast platform you choose. Encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, where clips of the show along with the full video version is posted to YouTube. We will continue to have, when it makes sense, some reaction videos. If the Colts make any major signings or land some trades, we'll continue to get more active there as we move through free agency and get closer to the draft and see how this roster continues to shake out. Joel and I will continue to have stories every day on indiastar.com about free agency and looking ahead to the draft, to encourage you to go and read those and hopefully subscribe to the Indy Star if you don't already. We would really appreciate it. But for now, this is it for the Colts Cover 2 podcast. Have a great weekend, and we will talk to you next time.